If somebody is born with an Arabic name taken from the Qur'an, a so-called Muslim name, does that automatically make them a believer? Somebody who believes that there is one God and that there will be a day of judgment, does that automatically make them a believer? Somebody who converts to Islam and says the shahadah, does that automatically make them a believer? In today's video, we will be studying the Qur'an to answer 3 questions. Question number 1, what do we have to have belief in, faith in, to be a believer? What are the components of Imaan? Question number 2, what does it mean to have Imaan, belief? And number 3, is having Imaan, faith, enough to achieve what God has promised us? Assalamu alaikum, I'm Munib Ali. Welcome to another video on the Quran Study channel. So as I mentioned, we will be looking into these 3 questions today. I will come back to this, but one of the things I want us to do together is complete this diagram. It is so crucial for us to understand the link between Iman, submission, and righteous deeds. And as we go through the study of Iman, we're going to start making notes on this page, study notes, so that we can remember what we are learning. And by the end of the study, we will have completed this diagram. And once it is completed, I'm going to upload it onto the community page on our YouTube channel. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to be able to pick up this particular note. And don't forget, we upload new videos about studying the Quran every week, so it's definitely worth subscribing to the channel. Okay, question number 1. In what do we have to have Iman in, faith in, a belief in, to be a believer? This one I will go through relatively quickly because I want to spend a bit more time on question 2. But there are 5 segments of Iman according to the Quran. Number 1, belief in the one God, the creator, the nourisher. Number 2, all the prophets. And Allah makes it clear in the Quran that we should not distinguish between any of his prophets. That is a fundamental part of Iman. No distinction between the prophets. We should reflect on that. We should ask ourselves a question. Do we hold one prophet in high regard compared to the others? Let's just ask ourselves that question. Are we complying with this particular segment of Iman? Let's just think. Just take that away and think about it. Okay? Right, so the third one is God's revelations. The Quran and all the other books that were revealed previously through all his previous prophets. Number 4, Malaika. Now I've maintained the Arabic word here because the common translation, angels, has the wrong connotation in people's minds. What Malaika really means is all the forces that Allah has created which govern the happenings in this entire universe. All the forces which act according to Allah's commands. Those forces are called Malaika. And number 5, the last day. The day when we all will be resurrected and judged. Now I have given the references from the Quran from which we get these 5 segments. Please open the Quran and take a look at them. And please reflect on whether we believe in these 5 segments. Now, the important question for today. What does it actually mean to have Iman? How is it defined? Now normally, Iman is translated as belief or faith. But according to the Quran, what it actually means is conviction. Something that you are convinced about, utterly convinced about, based on knowledge, evidence, and reason. Something that you have no doubt about because you have seen or felt the evidence and you have used your logic to understand it. Because only then And this is very important. Only then can you mentally fully accept that as a fact. That is Iman. Something where you have the intellectual satisfaction that it is the truth. So for example, when I hold this pen, I can see it, I can feel it, and when I use it and I see the ink, I'm convinced, utterly convinced that this is a pen. My Iman is that this is a pen. That is the same faith that you have to have in the 5 segments which we saw earlier. So the question is, how do we actually get that evidence, and how do we fully mentally accept that the 5 segments that we studied are the truth? Well, there are 2 steps. The first step is that you have to receive the evidence. And in this case, there are 2 ways in which you receive the evidence. First one is God's revelations, the signs and the evidence that Allah gives to us in the Qur'an. The Qur'an is full of evidence that the 5 segments we discussed are the truth. The second part of step 1 is that we have our own senses and we have our practical observations of living day to day. We see things around us, we feel things, we can hear things. We are receiving knowledge and evidence through our senses every day. So you receive evidence, step 1. Step 2 is that we then have to process that evidence. And that processing is done by our minds, our brains, our God-given intellect. You see, we have to use our logic and reason to process that evidence and then see that, aha, yes, that is the truth. I am now fully satisfied. I can mentally accept that it is the truth. That is when you have Iman. The important thing here is that blind faith is not Iman. Simply believing for the sake of believing is not Iman. Using our brains, using our mind, thinking is critical here. Now, let's have a look at some verses from the Qur'an in order to help us get our heads around this. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, and this will show us that we cannot blindly follow or accept these 5 segments of Iman. The first one, Surah Yusuf, which is 12, verse 108. Allah says, say. So Allah's telling the Prophet here to say something to people. This is my way. I invite to Allah with reason and evidence. Allah basiratin. So Allah's telling the Prophet to tell people to come onto the path of Allah after the Prophet has used his own reason and obtained his own evidence that it is the truth. And he's telling the Prophet, tell people, I'm inviting you towards the path of Allah after I have thought about this and I have seen the evidence and I've used my reason. I'm not asking you to follow blindly. Let's have a look at another one. Surah Al-Furqan, which is 25, verse 73. They are those... Now, this particular verse is part of a group of verses where Allah is talking about people who submit to Allah. So they are those who, when reminded of the revelation of their Lord, do not fall upon them as if deaf and blind. This is so important. Allah is telling us that when it comes to His own commands, which are contained in the Qur'an, He commands us not to just fall upon them, deaf and blind, without thinking about them. He wants us to think about them first, understand the logic, the reason, and then when we have fully mentally accepted them, then follow Allah's commands. Think about that. Even Allah's own commands, we must not follow until we have thought about them, used reason and logic. Next, Surah Al-Anfal 8, verse 22. The worst of all creatures in God's sight are the deaf, the dumb, those who do not think. La yaqilun, those who do not think. How powerful is this verse and this message? The worst of Allah's creatures. Imagine how many millions of creatures exist. Allah is saying the worst are those people who do not think. Allah has given us something to think with. The worst are those who do not think. Imagine that. Now this is the last verse we will study on this point. Surah Al-A'raf, which is 7, verse 179. Indeed, we have destined many jinn and men for hell. They have hearts they do not understand with, eyes they do not see with, and ears they do not hear with. They are like cattle. In fact, they are even less guided. Such are neglectful. There are so many messages in this verse, but the two key ones we should think about for today's study is that number one, those who do not think, who do not use reason, will fail in achieving the goals for this life and the hereafter. They are doomed, they will be punished. And the second point we can pick up from this is that those people Allah is saying are even less guided than cattle. We can see how important it is to use our minds and not to have blind faith. And I can tell you, if you get closer to the Qur'an and if you use your senses as I described, you see the evidence of those 5 segments we studied. Let's just go back for a second to those 2 steps we discussed. Step 1 was receiving evidence through the Qur'an and our senses and practical observations. Let's reflect. Do we allow ourselves to receive that evidence from the Qur'an? Are we close enough to this? Do we spend time understanding the signs that Allah has given us in the Qur'an? Do we teach our children to receive the signs which are in here in order for them to be able to establish true Imaan, true faith? Do we really use this as the primary source to obtain that Imaan? To get that mental acceptance and have no doubts? And secondly, let's just think about this. When it comes to our deen, do we really allow our brains to process any information? Or do we simply follow what others have told us? And do we say, look, this is what we have been told. We should not challenge it. We should not think about it. We must simply believe it. This is what our forefathers did, so let's just do it and believe it. This is what the Mufti over here told us, or the Imam over there told us, so we must simply believe it. Do we make sure there is a difference between us and the cattle? Let's take that away and think about it. Do we have true Iman? I posed some questions at the beginning of the video. I said people who are born into a Muslim family who have an Arabic name, which is taken from the Qur'an, does that automatically mean they have Iman? People who are converting to Islam and they state the shahadah, does that by itself mean that they have established Iman? Is Iman that simple? Let's ponder, let's think, let's use our God-given intellect to think about those things. Let's put some notes on this study sheet that we can share between us. So we looked at Iman today, and we studied the 5 segments. God, prophets without any distinction between them, very important. God's revelations, the Qur'an and all the other books that were revealed previously. Malaika, and the last day. And we also studied the definition of Iman, which is a conviction, an utter conviction based on knowledge, evidence and reason. We discussed that to have Iman in the 5 segments, we have to receive and understand and accept the evidence of those 5 things using God's revelations and our senses and observations. And thirdly, very importantly, it is not blind faith. Now the third question was, once we have established that Iman, once we have that utter conviction in the 5 segments that we studied. The question is that even enough to achieve what God has promised us in this life and the hereafter? Now, because I've given us so much to think about already, I'm going to leave that to the next video. But before you go, let me tell you about some of the things that we're going to be studying in order to answer that question, because this is going to be very interesting. There are 3 things we will look at. Number 1, we're going to be touching on Iblis, Shaitan, Satan. Number 2, we will talk about the heart, and we'll see how that fits into all of this conversation. And number 3, we're going to go back to righteous deeds, which we did 2 videos on recently. And we're going to link this all up. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, because it's definitely going to be a very interesting study. If you found this video useful, please do click on like and subscribe to our channel, and I will see you next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
أفلا يتدبرون القرآن